The general idea is that you're eating when you're active and when you're awake. And sometimes when you do these 12 to 8 things and you might be someone who's up and going at 6 a.m., that's where you really try to see some negative effects.
Welcome to the Proof Podcast, a space for science-based conversation exploring the health and longevity benefits that come with mastering nutrition, physical exercise, mindfulness, recovery, sleep, and alignment. Facts, nuance, and trustworthy recommendations, minus the hyperbole. Hey friends, great to be here with you. I'm your host, Simon Hill. I'm a qualified physiotherapist and nutritionist with an undergraduate science degree and a master's in the science of human nutrition. Today I sit down with Emily Manoogian, PhD, and Courtney Peterson, PhD, to talk about time-restricted eating, a form of fasting where you typically eat within a 6 to 10 hour eating window, as opposed to eating over 12 to 15 hours as the average person tends to today. Both Emily and Courtney are scientists on the ground, actively conducting research with human subjects, looking at how meal timing affects our health. Given the media headlines over the past few weeks following a brand new trial out of China, this is a very timely conversation. We know that calorie restriction and weight loss can improve health, and we know that time-restricted eating can promote weight loss, but does eating in a smaller window offer any inherent metabolic benefits beyond weight loss? Some believe it doesn't, others believe it does. Today we get into the details of this in what I believe is a really illuminating conversation with two legitimate experts from this field of science. Please enjoy the episode, and I'll catch you on the other side, where I'll leave you with a few of my own key takeaways from this conversation. Dr. Peterson, Dr. Manoogian, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
I thought it might be nice here at the beginning just to hear your thoughts on TRE, time-restricted eating, being in the media over the last few weeks. Being scientists that are studying this area of nutrition science, how does it feel to see mainstream media writing about time-restricted eating? Is it exciting for you to see whether it's good or bad things that they're saying?
Yeah, I think it is exciting to see it kind of going out into the real world. We put all this work in this kind of academic bubble, and so it's great when it gets out there and can be put to use. However, it is quite concerning when we see it being oversimplified and sending the wrong message, because then it's kind of counterintuitive to everything that we're trying to do and trying to get out to people. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag.
Yeah, and I'll say from my perspective, when we first started doing intermittent fasting research a decade ago, it wasn't really on the public radar. Most people had never heard of intermittent fasting. So one of the big gratifying things for me is now almost everyone you talk to knows about it now. So fasting and intermittent fasting have become mainstream, which I think is huge.
Mm-hmm. And we'll come to some of the definitions in a moment, TRE, TRF, fasting, and just clarify a few things there. But I thought I would ask a kind of simple question here at the top to perhaps direct this conversation. Right now, there seems to be a debate out there between scientists, between people in the general public about the inherent benefits of fasting independent of weight loss. And you'll see one side folks saying that whether it's fasting or tracking the energy in your food, all that matters is the weight loss component. And the New York Times article this week included a quote from Ethan Weiss, who he's been on the show previously. We were talking about cardiovascular disease. And he said that there is no benefit to eating in a narrow window, which essentially saying that, if you eat 1,800 calories over, say, 14 hours, versus 1,800 calories over 8 hours, for example, there's not going to be a material difference with regards to your health. And then on the other side, plenty of scientists, including yourselves, believe that when we eat does matter. So my question to you, and I realize that this is probably quite nuanced, but I'm hoping for a relatively short answer at this stage, and then we can unpack things. Do you think the amount of hours in which we consume our food each day matters in a material way to our health? Or based on some of these recent studies with humans, are you of the view that restricted eating, time-restricted eating appears to be mostly driven by weight loss, the benefits of it.
Yeah. So we're up to maybe about 80 or 90 clinical trials on various forms of intermittent fasting, about 50 on time-restricted eating. And by and large, the results are mixed. They're about split down the middle, 50-50. About 50% of the studies find a weight loss benefit for intermittent fasting. The other half don't. But there are plenty of studies, I would say now, that find benefits independent of how many calories you eat. So, and this dates back actually to about 2013 when some of the first studies, large-scale long-term studies, were done. And we've done work in my lab where we found that even if we feed participants the same number of calories, if they have a longer fasting period each day, they actually have better insulin sensitivity, lower blood pressure levels, and lower levels of oxidative stress. So I think there's enough robust evidence. It's just the evidence is mixed, and we can delve into that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think where a lot of the confusion comes in is also the target population that you're doing the study within. And so these recent papers that came out, and the paper that the New York Times article was based on, was looking specifically at individuals that were overweight but were otherwise healthy. And even in that trial, they saw no adverse effects of time-restricted eating, which some people bring up as a concern, but it was paired with caloric restriction. I think you see somewhat of a ceiling effect there. But I would agree, even in the absence of weight loss, or maybe in conjunction with weight loss, there seems to be very large benefits to cardiometabolic health, especially in those that are already at risk for those factors. So already have elevated blood pressure, you see blood pressure come down, things like that. But if you have a healthy population and there's nowhere for that to move, you're not going to see that change there.
Yeah, and the recent article in the New England Journal of Medicine involved individuals who are about 30 years old on average. That's really young.
Mm-hmm.
Most studies are working in middle-aged adults who already have elevated risk factors. So this study was unusual in that regard.
Okay, well, we'll dig into that study a little further as we move through this conversation. Perhaps now is a good time to make sense of some of this terminology that we're throwing around here. Time-restricted eating, often also time-restricted feeding is used depending on the type of study. We hear intermittent fasting. We hear about fasting. Can we kind of define some of these terms so that as we're progressing through the conversation, things are making a little bit more sense?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it, Courtney, if you have any corrections, please, because there's some debate in that. Intermittent fasting is a general term for saying you're having periods where you're having either 0 calories except for water or limited calories within a day. And the two most common forms of that are alternate day fasting and 5-2 fasting. Some people also consider time-restricted eating a form of intermittent fasting, and that can be also called a 16-8 diet. But time-restricted eating in general is where you consume all calories, really anything that isn't water, to a 6 to 12, usually 6 to 10 hour eating interval. And the rest of that time, you are only consuming water, and it's a consistent daily eating window. This doesn't move around. Time-restricted feeding was originally termed in the basic not clinical, but the basic trials done in animals. And when it switched to clinical trials, humans really don't like being told that they feed. So the term got switched to eating. So some people still use TRF when referring to clinical trials. But at least in our work, we switched all of our clinical work to refer to as TRE.
Yeah, and there's a little bit of debate on what's the minimum duration of hours and number of hours you need to be practicing fasting for something to constitute intermittent fasting. And I would say most people these days say it's at least 12 to 14 hours of fasting.
And then something else that comes up in the literature, and no doubt will come up in this conversation, is this idea of early time-restricted eating versus later time-restricted eating. Can, Courtney, perhaps you could help us understand the differences between those?
Sure, absolutely. So when you're practicing time-restricted eating, you're eating in a shorter time period each day. And you can do that by either eating breakfast later in the day and or dinner earlier in the day. And what's really interesting is there's been research out of Israel showing that eating breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper actually improves weight loss, blood sugar control, lowers your appetite, and also actually even improves fertility. So really impressive results. So there's been this sort of discussion or debate in the scientific community. Can you get the same benefits of time-restricted eating regardless of the time of day of your eating window? And so we're starting to see research on that topic, but we don't know the answer yet. So one of the big things that's been tested is, time-restricted eating by skipping breakfast. So the study you mentioned with Ethan Weiss, they actually compared practicing time-restricted eating by skipping breakfast with 3 meals a day. So the time-restricted eating group actually ate a little bit later in the day. Now, they didn't see positive results in that study, but there are also other studies that find benefits, even if you practice time-restricted eating by eating later in the day.
Yeah, and there are some groups in Australia as well that did both early and delayed eating within the same group and saw pretty much the same results. There were minor differences in the early group. I think one of the other confounds here is all of the trials that have done that have not been relative to an individual schedule. So they've been a set clock hour in the day, which doesn't take into account when someone is waking up, when someone is going to sleep. And it kind of depends. Like some trials require that eating window to be a set 10 hours or 8 hours for everyone in the trial, regardless of their schedule. Whereas others allow you to pick a schedule that works for you. And so what we've kind of seen when we allow participants to choose their own eating window, that it's not a matter of skipping any meals. It's just a matter of maybe delaying breakfast by an hour and advancing dinner by a couple of hours rather than doing a full skip to some extreme that they wouldn't be able to stick to long term.
Okay, let's put a pin in that Israel study that you mentioned there, Courtney. Was that the work of, was it Jacobowitz? Did I pronounce that correctly?
That's correct, Daniela Jacobowitz.
Yeah, let's come back to that because I think there's some interesting things within that to kind of flesh out a little bit. But as we're kind of just moving into TRE here, I'm interested, before we get into some of the details of the human studies, I'm interested in just the area of science in general that kind of paved the way for all of these studies that we're now seeing. There seems like there's a bounty of human-based studies looking at TRE, particularly in the last 5 years. And there's a whole lot of research groups. You mentioned there research groups in Australia. There's both of your groups. Where did all of this come from, and why does this seem to be a kind of very interesting type of fasting compared to some of the other fasting protocols that were perhaps a little bit more popular 5-10 years ago?
Yeah, so it's actually rose in 2 different areas, and I'll let Emily speak to the chronobiological angle. So I'll speak to the kind of intermittent fasting, more the intermittent fasting communities angle or metabolism angle. So actually, one of the studies that really we can trace the modern resurgence of interest in intermittent fasting to was a study out of Mark Mattson's lab in 2003. And it was actually based on a bet with him and his postdoc, Mike Anson. And they had been doing these lifespan studies with calorie restriction. And we know calorie restriction or reducing your calories by a significant amount extends lifespan. And so they were having a debate about whether the benefits of calorie restriction were due to the fact that the animals, by necessity, were eating in a shorter time period each day and had a longer fasting duration, or whether it was because they were eating fewer calories. And so they put this to the test. They did a study in rodents, and they compared intermittent fasting. In this case, it was an alternate day fasting program to calorie restriction. And interestingly enough, they found that the alternate day fasting group actually did better than the calorie restriction group, even when matched for calories. And so they had lower glucose and insulin levels, and the neurons were more stress resistant. They were better able to survive under external stressors. And since then, at least from in the metabolic community, there's been a huge resurgence of interest in just studying intermittent fasting and understanding the mechanisms that may have these benefits for lifespan and other aspects of health.
Is that also one of the explanations for why those 2 large studies looking at primates saw differences in outcomes, possibly explained by the feeding patterns? I think I've heard you speak about that before.
Yeah, absolutely. So there were 2, just to give the audience a sense, so there were 2 large studies done in monkeys where they were trying to see if calorie restriction extended lifespan. And the 2 different studies got completely opposite results. One study found that there was absolutely no benefit for extending lifespan, and the other found a benefit. And interestingly enough, the group that found a benefit only ate once per day, and the group that found no benefit had the monkeys eat twice per day. So it may have just been the timing of when the monkeys were eating. And so actually there's another research group that went back and kind of put this to the test. So they kind of did a reverse experiment. They said, let's go figure out why these two primate studies got different results. And so they ran a study trying to mimic the diets of the two different groups that got conflicting results and playing around with parameters, the healthfulness of the diet versus the time of day. And they found that it had, at least in the rodents, there was actually no benefit of eating a healthier diet in terms of lifespan extension. And instead, they found at least 40% of the life extending benefits of calorie restriction are actually, in fact, due to time restricted eating. So huge finding in the field.
Okay, and so these proposed benefits of eating less frequently or eating within a smaller eating window then tie back to our circadian rhythms and nurturing those. Is that right, Emily?
Yeah, so I think it's that. I think it's also that you're probably having an increasing ketone production, and so you're changing the way cells are functioning. So there's kind of two things that are coming in there. And if you look more at some of the intermittent fasting studies, like alternate day fasting, you're probably not optimizing a circadian rhythm in that pattern, right? If you're not having this consistent daily feeding cue. And so I think there really are two components to it. One is just that you're getting longer durations of fasting. And then the second component is this circadian component where you're really kind of working with your body at many different levels. And that kind of ties into what I think Courtney was alluding to is the other way that the field got to this, which started in rodents who were fed a high-fat diet. And everyone, it's a kind of a common model. It's called diet-induced obesity. You feed rodents a high-fat diet and they gain weight. But was also observed was that they also change the timing of when they eat when they're given a high-fat diet. So mice on regular chow will mainly eat during the night when they're active because they're nocturnal. But when you give them a high-fat diet, they actually start to eat more calories during the day as well. So rather than only eating at night, they're eating across the day. So the very simple experiment was to say, well, what if they eat that same high-fat diet, but they're only allowed to eat it when they normally would eat? And when you do that, they don't gain weight. They stay lean. They don't develop fatty liver like they do when they're allowed to eat whenever they want. And these were really very robust results. And then this was replicated many times in many different labs and has shown benefits for a variety of different diseases and kind of general health.
And is that independent of weight loss, of calories? So in those two scenarios, whether you're feeding the mice at times when they shouldn't be eating versus feeding them when they should be eating, are you seeing different outcomes independent of calories being consumed?
Yes, it's completely independent of calories. So they're the exact same number of calories. And that's why in the rodent studies, you don't see it shorter than 8 hours, because if you give them an eating window shorter than 8 hours, they can't eat the same number of calories as the group that can eat whenever they want. So if you give them somewhere between 8 and 9 hours, they'll still consume the same total amount of calories, but they won't gain weight doing it. So in that regard, it's very strong evidence for calorie is not a calorie. At any time of day, it does matter when you eat it. And in a lot of the human trials, it's hard to discern that, because when you put a human on time restricted eating, they might eat less calories, which is why it's so great that we have some work done from Courtney's lab where she does control everything that they eat. And so she can say they ate the exact same food and she's still seeing those benefits just by changing when they get it.
So I know that, Emily, you've been on the show before and you explained our circadian rhythms in a lot of detail, but I think it will be important for us to kind of trace back over some of that. So when you're saying that eating at different times of the day can affect our health differently, and this relates back to circadian biology, can you break that down for us, go right back to what our circadian rhythms are, this idea of a central clock, peripheral clocks, and how this kind of all ties together with meal timing?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it short. So ask more follow-ups. I'll really try to keep this one short because there's a lot we could go into. The circadian system is really an anticipatory system in your body that prepares your body to do whatever it would need to do. So it's going to help your digestive system kind of shut down and break down calories that you already have when you're sleeping so you can fuel yourself when it expects you to fast. It's going to predict when it should have a cortisol spike to help you wake up. It's going to predict when your heart rate needs to be lower or your muscle strength needs to be stronger. You are functionally a different person at different times of day from every level, from behavior molecular structure, like anything that you would get measured at a doctor's office pretty much changes at different times of day, hormone release, anything like that. And we don't, we have to take in cues from our environment. We all have about a 24-hour pattern of how all of these processes work to keep, everything in the right place at the right time. But we coordinate these with the environment. And the two main cues that we get are light and food. So light is going to be the biggest cue to talk to this clock in your brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is just a geographical term that sounds very complicated. It's just where it's located. But that part of your brain will integrate light signals. It'll help control your sleep-wake patterns, and it kind of talks to all the other clocks throughout your body. And when I say clocks throughout your body, pretty much every cell in your body has a clock. But when you eat, actually directly affects each of those individual clocks directly, because nutrition availability directly signals the cells to say what time of day it is. So if you're eating at the same time every day and you're fasting at the same time every day, your body can predict that. It can have enzymes ready to digest things. It can help coordinate other things that are going on within the cell, because food availability is a very strong cue to tell the cell what time of day it is. Whereas if you're eating at inoptimal times, when your body wouldn't expect it, say the middle of the night, one, your insulin secretion is shut down, so you can't process your glucose properly. Two, you're telling your body it's a different time of day. It may try to shift those clocks directly. There's many different things that can kind of be kind of compromised as how your body would function just by when you're actually eating that food.
So I'm just thinking about this and just throwing this out loud. But let's say it's 11 p.m. at night and it's dark. My central clock is detecting that, or being regulated by that change in light from light to darkness, and anticipating that I'm about to go into a state of rest. But then let's say I go and eat a meal. Is it the peripheral clocks that are then becoming disrupted? They're thinking that it's still time to be active and digesting, whilst the central clock is saying, hey, it's time to rest and relax. And so you get kind of a sort of a loss of alignment between those two clocks.
It's a little bit like that. And it's also it's a little bit that, eating is a stimulation cue anyway. It's an arousal cue in its own regard. Like if you're driving late at night and you get tired, the first thing you do is start snacking, and it'll help you wake up. So eating at the wrong time kind of sends a cue to your whole body that it's the wrong time. But like things like when you talk about it's getting dark, well, one of the things that happens at night when it's getting dark is melatonin is secreted. Melatonin directly inhibits insulin secretion. So say you have a milkshake in the middle of the night. Well, now your body can't process that glucose. You might get a really high spike in blood glucose, and those kinds of things that are happening perpetually over and over again can lead to things like prediabetes or diabetes.
Yeah. And the way you can kind of think about these misalignments between the clock is a really simple level. So, if your central clock says it's dark outside, it's saying, okay, let's slow metabolism down. Meanwhile, you're eating, so your peripheral clocks are like, let's pick it up. So it's effectively like you get conflicting signals and your metabolism is confused. So you get all kinds of problems in your metabolism.
Mm-hmm. And when you said a calorie is not a calorie earlier, that's a statement that I know ruffles a lot of feathers. And I just want to clarify. So you're not saying that the unit of energy is different. What you're saying is at different times of the day, our body is utilizing that energy differently. Is that right?
Yeah. So you're going to process it differently. How it's going to affect your system is different. So like, even if, say you had a lot of lights on and you're skewed and your melatonin wasn't high for whatever reason, you're still sending a cue to your circadian clocks to say that it's a certain time of day, right? Like there's a lot of different pathways, and we don't have enough time or detail to go into all of them. But there are dozens of molecular pathways that are directly affected by, gaining, by nutrient detection, and that are affected by the circadian clock. And most of them are affected by both, like these work hand in hand. And so when you give this kind of conflicting cue, it throws the system off. And if you do it once, the system's pretty robust. You don't kind of phase shift overnight. Your body doesn't say, oh, I got this at midnight, so now this is now 6 p.m. and I'm going to shift 6 hours in one day. Like it doesn't do that. But when you have these erratic cues, like some days I start eating at 6 a.m. and some days I start eating at 11 and some days I end eating at midnight. Some days I end eating at 5. Like your body has no idea what time it is anymore. And those rhythms over time get completely dampened. And so all of those processes are not able to work properly. And so you're really just kind of compromising the overall system.
So today, are you of the view that this kind of chronic circadian disruption, and I've heard you use that terminology before, as opposed to, say, acute circadian disruption, which people experience when they fly to the other side of the world, are you of the view that this is an integral sort of contributing factor to chronic disease that we see today? And to take that a step further, if you look back, let's say 100, 200, 300 years with whatever data we have access to, have we seen a change in our meal timing over the years?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that is definitely a kind of a underlying problem that we become very ignorant to. And when we had kind of the industrial revolution and around the clock ability to work and consume food and all of these things that we didn't have hundreds of years ago, we have started to kind of abuse the system that we had, we didn't know we were doing. We just kind of thought, oh, this is available, I can do it now. And we didn't realize how much we were hurting ourselves. So I do think that's kind of a chronic overlying problem. And I think, I think that's how I would say it. I think chronic circadian disruption is a big contributor to a lot of chronic diseases, whatever they may be.
And the WHO now classifies night shift work as a likely carcinogen, right? So that goes to show you how good the evidence is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so these animal studies are performed, and this hypothesis gets established that shortening the eating window is potentially beneficial to human health, and the benefits, partly via chronobiology, may be independent of weight loss. And so that sort of paves the way to say, hey, let's go and test this in human subjects and ask a few questions and see what we find. Walk me through the kind of history there with regards to the early human studies that we saw with time-restricted eating. And then, Courtney, I know that you alluded to a paper that I think you did with Catherine Sutton, which, if I'm correct, was the first study that looked at controlling for weight loss and trying to tease out if there are any independent benefits to time-restricted eating over and above losing weight.
Yeah, well, really, we can trace a lot of the interest in time-restricted eating back to the 2012 paper out of Sachin Panda's lab at the Salk Institute that really started the field of focus on time-restricted eating. And very shortly afterwards, Sachin's group also did a small study in, I think it was 8 individuals who were overweight. It was a year-long study, and they had them shorten their eating window by about 4 hours. And they found that they slept better, they lost more weight, they lost about 3% of their body weight, and they ate less as well. And my lab back in 2012, we saw some of the data out of Sachin Panda's lab, and I'd also been inspired by some of the studies that Mark Mattson had done. And I thought, this is fantastic. We should try this in humans. So we kind of proceeded in parallel. And I was in particular interested in what happens if you combine time-restricted eating with eating early in the day in alignment with these circadian rhythms in metabolism. And I was interested in the question, what's the maximal benefit that we can get with meal timing, right? If we optimize all aspects of meal timing. And so we started off by doing a study that was looking at, are there any intrinsic benefits to intermittent fasting that are independent of weight loss? So independent of whether you lose weight and then exactly what you're eating. So we did what's called a controlled feeding study. And this is where you feed participants all the food that they plan to eat, and you match the amount of food that they eat across groups. So that way, you know, if there's any difference between groups, it's just due to the time of day they eat. Not to the food itself. And so we did a study. We recruited 8 men with prediabetes. And for 5 weeks at a time, they either ate over a schedule mimicking what the median American does. So they were eating over about a 12-hour period. Or we had them try eating all their food over a 6-hour period. And they started breakfast at the same time in both groups. So one group Control group was fasting for 12 hours a day, and the time-restricted eating group was fasting for 18 hours a day. So it's a pretty big difference, 6-hour difference in the fasting duration. And after 5 weeks, we measured their blood sugar control, blood pressure, and cardiovascular disease risk factors. And we found that the men had lower insulin levels and better insulin sensitivity. So insulin sensitivity is kind of your body's ability to process the sugar in your bloodstream and move it into your cells. So they had better insulin sensitivity than when they ate over a 12-hour period. And not only that, but their beta cells in their pancreas, these are the special cells that produce insulin, were actually more responsive to glucose in their bloodstream. So that's an important thing too, because it shows that, glucose metabolism is basically working better in the body. And in that study, we actually found a pretty large drop in their blood pressure. Time-restricted eating lowered their blood pressure by about 10 points, which honestly to us was pretty shocking. We didn't expect such a large benefit because none of our participants in this study had hypertension. So it's a pretty large drop in blood pressure. And then we found also less oxidative stress in their body. So we looked at something called 8-isoprostane, which is a measure of sort of how much molecular damage there is to fat in the body. And so, for instance, we know in cardiovascular disease, oxidized fat builds up in your blood vessels, and that actually leads to narrowing and stiffening of the blood vessels. And we actually found less levels of these oxidized byproducts. So, and so we found a bunch of different benefits. Now, we didn't find any benefits in our particular study for cholesterol. So we don't think that any benefits we see, at least we don't think, my group doesn't think that any benefits for cholesterol are independent of weight loss. We think those benefits are probably driven by weight loss. But we were able to show that there are some intrinsic benefits to intermittent fasting that are independent of, whether you're losing weight or not.
I think you bring up a really good point here. Sometimes, particularly in mainstream media, there's this idea of an intervention either works or it doesn't work. But there is so much nuance. What population are we looking at? What are we comparing to? So in this study, if I've heard correctly, there's quite a big exposure difference in terms of the two groups and how long they're fasting for, which is important because as we come to some of these other newer studies, that contrast doesn't exist. And just to kind of remind the listeners, that's not something that's specific to this area of nutrition science. It exists everywhere across the board. If you look at a particular food, for example, and you're looking at intake of that and how it affects health outcomes, if there's insufficient contrast between the two groups you're comparing, you may not see a difference. So it's nothing new there, but it's important to kind of dig into the study to be able to help explain things. The other thing there that you mentioned was the improvement in insulin sensitivity, and these subjects had pre-diabetes.
Correct. And I would say half of our participants were borderline for type 2 diabetes. They're just shy of that. So, as Emily mentioned earlier, the participants that you study are really important. So we took people who we know, they already had impairments in their blood sugar. So if there's a benefit for improving blood sugar, we should be able to see it in our study. And not all studies do that.
Right. So it might be that some benefits or metabolic benefits that are independent of weight loss may be subject to the baseline health of the person that is doing the intervention. Would you agree with that?
Yes. Absolutely.
Or they're preventative, and these studies aren't done over decades to know that it would have a preventative effect long term.
That's a good point too. And then the other question that I have for you, or comment, Courtney, is someone listening might think 6-hour eating window, geez, that's tough. And I'll put my hand up. I'm one of those people that is thinking that. So, and I understand the rationale for the study. You wanted to get sufficient contrast in that exposure to really see if there was a difference. And I'm interested in if you measured adherence or any type of qualitative type feedback from the subjects. How did they go with it?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So we actually forced them to be adherent in the study. They didn't have a choice. But generally, they struggled, perhaps not in the way you'd expect. So they actually struggled to eat all the food in that 6-hour period because they felt so stuffed. So imagine eating Thanksgiving like a Thanksgiving, meal, dinner type meal every day in a 6-hour period, So that's kind of how it was for them. So we actually I don't recommend 6-hour windows for most people. I think 8 to 10 is a much better target. Obviously, we studied what we studied in this particular first study, but we think 8 to 10 hours is a better target for most people. And I will tell you, at the end of the study, we asked our participants, hey, what do you think the average person could do? And on average, they thought an 8-hour window would be more doable for most people.
What is it about, say, a 12-hour eating window versus a 10 or an 8-hour eating window that kind of makes the difference there? Is there some sort of threshold where the body, switches into a kind of fasting state? Is that why that's important?
Yeah, I think that's where it's kind of going, and more research needs to be done on that. And again, it's fairly nuanced. So depending on what your last meal is and how much you have of it is going to change, and how long it'll be until you get to that fasted state. Additionally, like if you're working out right after, or if you're just sitting down, those are going to be very different things that will impact how fast you get there. But generally, I think the general consensus is you probably need 10 to 12 hours before you would even start to have any kind of ketogenesis going on. And that once you get past that, you would have more ketone production. And so that 12-hour mark is kind of right where we think you're probably not hurting yourself too much, but you don't see a lot of benefits. And there was a study done in Switzerland where they did find just that, where they did a 12-hour intervention. And there was another one in South America, I believe. And they didn't see any direct benefits of the 12-hour eating interval. And it seems like that's just a little bit too long to see any benefits there. Whereas when we do even 10-hour interventions and participants shift a little up closer to 11, you do still see benefits. So it seems like there's something that below 12 is beneficial. And the studies that have gone very short, like 4 hours compared to 8 hours, don't really see any benefits in the 4-hour. So it does seem like 8 to 10 is kind of the sweet spot.
And so would I be right that, Courtney, you mentioned there that you don't think there's any sort of independent effects on lipids at this stage with early time-restricted eating? You can correct me if I heard that wrong. But my read is that it does seem fairly consistent, or at least it's been reproduced a number of times, your study. And then I read a study, I think the first author was Robert Jones. That was a 2020 paper that looked at early time-restricted eating and insulin sensitivity. And then there was another study by Parr that I think was an Australian group, again, saw some improvements in glycemic control. Does that appear to be the kind of metabolic, the most reproducible metabolic benefit of time-restricted eating independent of weight loss? And second part of that question, how does the early time-restricted eating compare to kind of later time-restricted eating if we're talking about, say, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. versus midday to 8 p.m., which I think a lot of people who are doing intermittent fasting are kind of, that's their protocol. Do we know how those compare in terms of insulin sensitivity and glycemic control?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say for early time restricted eating, the most common result people find is an improvement in glycemic control. And it's something like 75% of all studies on early time restricted eating find an improvement in some aspects of glycemic control. And my lab did it with an oral glucose tolerance test. Other labs used other sophisticated procedures, but it's nice that different scientists using different methods have come to the same result. I'll say the second most common thing that we see, although it's not measured in a lot of studies, are improvements in blood pressure. And there have been some really elegant studies done in rodents where they find that when they eat earlier in the day, they actually excrete extra sodium, and that in turn lowers their blood pressure. And so we think those are the most common benefits. Now, most studies on time-restricted eating haven't looked at early time-restricted eating. They've looked at, time-restricted eating by skipping breakfast or just eating a little bit later in the day. Like Emily mentioned earlier, eating breakfast a little later, dinner a little earlier. To my knowledge, there have been 3 studies comparing early versus later time-restricted eating. So the one that Emily mentioned earlier, I think it was a 1-week-long study in 15 men, and they found by and large there were improvements in glycemic control in both the early and what they called delayed time-restricted eating. So this was time-restricted eating by skipping breakfast. And I think there was it was maybe fasting glucose that was a little better in the early time-restricted eating group, but by and large the benefits were really similar. More recently, there was a study out of Japan in 90 adults comparing early versus sort of middle of the day time-restricted eating. So in this study, they were comparing, I think it was 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. versus 11, starting after 11 and then ending 8 hours earlier. It was a 5-week study. And in this study, they found early time-restricted eating was better than both the control condition and midday time-restricted eating for weight loss, insulin sensitivity, the diversity of bacteria in your gut, and then also for lowering inflammation. So they kind of had a ranking where early time-restricted eating was better than midday time-restricted eating, which was better than kind of eating throughout the day.
When you say early time-restricted eating and you talk about 8 a.m., I just want to kind of get clear on something. Do any of these studies collect data to understand the average time that people wake up, and therefore when that first meal is, how distant that is from actually rolling out of bed? Are these people rolling out of bed and they having their first bite straight away, or is it a little bit delayed?
Depends on the study. We measure it in all of our studies, and when we say early time-restricted eating, we usually define that as eating within a 10-hour period that ends before about 5 p.m. All of our studies have been 6 or 8 hour windows, and we've always required our participants to start eating within 1 to 2 hours of waking up, or we've given them a fixed schedule. But it depends a lot on the study.
So there's no negative effect on glycemic control, for example, if you start that window as soon as you wake up. I'm just thinking with regards to where melatonin, cortisol, other hormones are. Do you need to allow a certain amount of time and get light exposure before your body is geared up? Or are you kind of ready to go and you're getting optimal glycemic control straight away?
Yeah, so great question. So the original data from the 1990s, we have Ed Van Cotter did a series of studies where she literally infused glucose just straight into people for 30 hours and looked at their blood sugar control. And she found even at 6 a.m. in the morning, they had better blood sugar control than later in the day or when they were sleeping. That said, it wasn't a large study. And what we now know is about half of people have a genetic mutation in their melatonin receptors. And in those individuals who have a certain mutation, it takes a little longer for melatonin levels to fall in the morning. So my suspicion is in some individuals, it's better to get bright light exposure before you start eating. So maybe wait more like an hour or two after eating. But I don't think we have a super clear answer on this yet.
Yeah, and in all of our studies where we let individuals choose when they want to eat, they generally choose 9 to 7, or the latest we see is 10 to 8, sometimes 8 to 6. But people usually don't go to an extreme. And I don't think there are any studies out there that have compared saying 8 to 4 versus 9 to 5. Is that really a significant difference? And I doubt that it would be. I think the general idea is that you're eating when you're active and when you're awake.
Sure.
And sometimes when you do these 12 to 8 things, and you might be someone who's up and going at 6 a.m., that's where you really try to see some negative effects of having it that much later in the day. But if you're someone who wakes up at 10 or 11 in the morning, which there are people that have circadian mutations that wake up later, then yeah, I wouldn't tell those people to try to wake up early to eat, like they should fit to their body. So I think the general rule we like to think of is like, wait at least an hour after you wake up and stop eating at least 3 or 4 hours before you go to bed, and then figure out what works for you. And if you're in that kind of zone, I don't think there's a huge difference between, 1 hour earlier or 1 hour later.
So in some ways, early is kind of relative to your sleep cycle and when you wake up.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems is that for people that might have to wake up very early to commute, maybe they have to wake up at 5 or 6 a.m. Maybe, like, I know school teachers sometimes have very early start times. They're forcing themselves to wake up very early. They're not even hungry yet. Melatonin is definitely still high, and then they're forcing themselves to eat. I think that's where you get a problem with early eating. Whereas if they gave the body a chance to wake up a little first before they ate, it would probably serve them a lot better.
Sure. It does seem, though, that the majority of people, at least that I know who are doing intermittent fasting, are doing it from midday to 8 p.m. So it would seem that in theory, at least, shifting that a little bit towards the earlier part of the day could be beneficial. But then the question that follows is adherence, and how would that be something that someone could implement into their lifestyle. And for example, if you're shifting your dinner from 8 p.m. down to 5 p.m., is that something that you can do socially? Does that work with your family, etc.? And I'm sure that's something that both of you have thought about.
Yeah, and in our recent study, we did a pretty extreme schedule, so to speak. We tried a 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. schedule and fast for the rest of the day. And it's actually really interesting. We asked people at the end of the study, what do you plan to do in the long term? And the control group, almost no one wanted to do the early time restricted eating. And about a quarter of people wanted to do time restricted eating by eating in the middle of the day. I was actually surprised more people in the control group didn't want to try time restricted eating, but that's the data. But among the people in the early time restricted eating group, we found 40% of them wanted to continue time restricted eating and early time restricted eating in some shape or form. So we're finding that once people try it, obviously it's not a majority of people, but a significant number of people want to continue with it.
Mm-hmm.
And in our particular study, we found benefits for mood. And so we're thinking, because they didn't know, that they were getting any extra weight loss benefit while they're in this study. But obviously you can sense how you feel it.
Mm.
And our participants reported having higher energy levels and less fatigue and fewer feelings of depression and dejection. And so we think there may be some benefits that might be appropriate for someone. Now, I doubt half the U.S. population is going to want to do early time restricted eating. So I always tell people, this is really the $1 million question in the field, right?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly what time of day can you practice time restricted eating and get benefits?
Sure.
Yeah, I would agree. I think a slightly earlier in the day is beneficial, but I think the evidence is strong enough that any time restricted eating is better than not at all. So if you have to eat dinner at 7:30 p.m. because that's when your family eats dinner and that's really important to you, then yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I would do that. But does it have to be 8 hours? Like, could you just eat 10 a.m. till 8 p.m.? Probably. I don't know that there's that much of an additional benefit there. I think, and to Courtney's point, that improved energy and decreased fatigue and increased mood was also seen in Sachit's paper in 2015. Even in those first few 8, that seems to be an across the board thing. And I've also seen across the board in many different populations is that you have this decreased hunger.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like people are starving during this period. They actually have decreased hunger overall. Again, probably because you're supporting the circadian system, that it's allowing your body to know when to rest.
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned mood. I'm involved in a study that's being designed at the moment, a group from Bond University in Australia that's looking at dietary patterns and mood, and they're doing, there's a preliminary study, and then the idea is to set up a new prospective study. But it could be interesting to actually include into that, get some data on folks' eating windows as well. So I'll make mention of that to them. You spoke there about adherence, and something that comes to mind here and can be a little bit of a segue into discussing some of these more recent trials. Often TRE is kind of put up head to head with calorie restriction, and we can go into whether that's a good idea or not. But I wonder, is there any data out there that speaks to adherence and looks at the differences between being able to stick to time restricted eating and lose weight versus tracking calories and losing weight that way?
Well, some of the earliest studies on time-restricted eating, literally the participants were only told, just restrict your eating. Don't worry about counting calories. They weren't given any instructions to eat healthier, and they spontaneously lost weight. And in these studies, they were typically losing something like 1% to 4% of their body weight. So this is, a significant amount. And so we have a really good, pretty solid body of evidence that when you tell people to restrict their food intake, they tend to lose weight. Now, if you combine that with calorie restriction, it kind of depends on the paradigm, right? So if you have a background, if you have a study that's pursuing very extreme calorie restriction, as Emily said earlier today, it can be sometimes hard to detect differences or additional weight loss benefits due to time-restricted eating because, the participants are already aggressively losing weight. But most of the studies that have measured appetite or food intake have found that it helps people spontaneously eat less. I think there's probably a small benefit, but, there for time-restricted eating. And we're starting to see meta-analyses that are now pulling the data across large numbers of studies. And they're kind of estimating that the average effect is about 2% weight loss relative to the control group. So not necessarily a large effect. And that effect can get lost if you're having a very aggressive weight loss study where people are already losing like 10% of their body weight. So it's just harder sometimes to detect these differences in large studies.
Yeah, and I think I agree with everything you just said. I think along those same lines, like the paper that just came out a couple days ago in obesity from Corey Reidner's group, um, there's a line in there that says like for the group that was doing both, and they were struggling with caloric restriction, so they told them to just focus more on time restricted eating, and they still saw the same change, right? So they also didn't have a huge difference between eating window within their participants. But I do think one of the ideas is that some people might be able to do caloric restriction, but if everyone could do caloric restriction and exercise all the time, this would kind of be probably we would never get to this point. But time restricted eating is an alternate way to potentially see large health benefits. And I don't think that weight is the only way that you get those benefits. And I don't even think it's the main outcome that I would look for as a benefit from time restricted eating.
So with that in mind, this kind of idea that or at least my assumption anyway, is that a number of people that are interested in time restricted eating are interested in it because they either have tried counting calories and haven't been able to adhere to it, or just don't feel like that's the right approach for them. And thus for them, the comparison is really between doing nothing and doing TRE. I wonder how you feel about some of these more recent studies where the time restricted eating group is being compared to calorie restriction, and often the time restricted eating group is doing calorie restriction at the same time.
I think they're interesting studies. I think it's nice to see that data. I think the only point where it gets concerning to me is when the media oversimplifies it to a point where it's a misleading message to say time restricted eating has no benefits, because again, I don't think those studies really weren't aimed to answer the questions that we're really looking at. I don't think anyone ever really thought that, if you're on an extreme caloric restriction, which especially the NEJM paper, they were achieving 35% caloric restriction in the first 3 months and then 25% at a year. That is far more caloric restriction than we see in caloric restriction studies in the US. Like the calorie trials had 25% for a period and they were having 15%, and they still saw benefits in weight loss of caloric restriction. So they did a great job. They also had two staff monitoring people every single day. Corey Reidner's group also had classes that people are going to. I mean, it's a very intensive behavioral intervention program to get people to follow caloric restriction. You're still only, it's an intensive program. And if you do that and people are adherent, which both of these studies had pretty good adherence, then of course you're going to see weight loss with caloric restriction. And to not see a significant difference beyond that with time restricted eating, I don't find surprising at all. And again, these participants are pretty young and healthy overall. And so you wouldn't see changes in other, in things like glucose regulation or blood pressure, which we do see in all of our other studies that with people that do have prediabetes or metabolic syndrome. And so I don't find these results shocking. I think it's really interesting to see that, hey, an 8-hour time restricted eating with caloric restriction is pretty much the same as a 10-hour or 11-hour time restricted eating with caloric restriction. Okay, maybe that's a little bit easier then to tell someone, just do 10 hours, do your caloric restriction that way. There's no reason to force yourself into 8. But beyond that, I don't think it is anything to say that time restricted eating isn't effective at what we had kind of hypothesized that it would be.
Yeah. Now, I will also even add, I don't think we're not yet at the point where we're doing very large studies to nail some of these questions definitively. I think if we had larger sample sizes, we would be able to answer these questions more definitively. So, I mean, even if you think about the whole debate versus low versus high carb diets, right? To really answer that question, they have to go to studies where they're enrolling 600 people, right? To definitively answer that question. We're still, most of our studies enrolling less than 100, right? So in any weight loss study, you will have people who gain weight, even though they're supposed to lose weight, and then people who lose massive amounts of weight. So with that kind of variability, it's much harder to see, smaller or moderate differences in weight loss.
Yeah, and on that example of low versus high carb, one of those diet studies that stands out is the Diet Fit study from Christopher Gardner's group. Yeah. And one of the very interesting findings there was the variance within each group. So some people did really well on low carb and some did really well on high carb. And unless you looked at a waterfall plot, you missed a lot of that variance. Correct. That does show that even though the averages were the same, there is a particular benefit for certain individuals. And then I guess the next question is, how do you test to kind of better predict who might do better with a certain intervention? Emily, you mentioned these two trials. which I think we just spent a little bit more time on. And the studies that I'm speaking to here are the Corey Reinders one, which came out of University of Colorado. I think that was just published in the last week or so. And then the one out of China published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is the one that sort of sparked the New York Times article. Both of these studies are relatively similar, I guess, in design. And these are the ones that I think might trip people up when they hear that time-restricted eating is not effective. And I know that you sort of spoke to some of the things in these papers, but I just want to spell things out a little bit more here. So what are the really important things to understand when it comes to, say, the differences in eating window between the intervention group and the control group in these studies, and also some of the kind of baseline, I guess, characteristics of the subjects that were included?
Yeah. So I think one thing to note just from the baseline is none of these are time-restricted eating versus nothing. It's time-restricted eating with caloric restriction or caloric restriction alone. The second caveat to that is even the caloric restriction alone group was debatably a form of time-restricted eating. So in the NEJM paper, at baseline, the participants had a little bit over a 10-hour eating window, which I would consider an intervention of just time-restricted eating in its own right. And then their TRE group had about 8 hours. So it is a little bit shorter, but it's really maybe about a 2-hour difference. Similarly, in the Reidner's paper, they had, I think, around 11 hours at baseline, and even the caloric restriction group did decrease to about 10 hours. And the time-restricted eating group was a little bit shorter than that, but it was only about an hour and a half difference between these two groups. So this wasn't like what we normally see, where there's usually at least a 4-hour difference between a time-restricted and a kind of control group for that. These were really quite similar, and none of them were beyond 12 hours. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. We're not talking about what kind of the median eating window we see in the US, which is about 14 plus hours.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about kind of shorting eating anyway. So that's a big confound to both studies. The other thing is with the Reidner's papers, as Courtney had mentioned, I think they were younger in general. And in both papers, the participants were already pretty healthy. They were overweight, but otherwise were pretty healthy. And so if you're looking for things like blood pressure changes or HbA1c, which is kind of an average blood glucose over the past 3 months, or fasting glucose, or even cholesterol, which fluctuates a lot based on diet, you're not going to see any really big changes in a group that has normal levels at baseline, and you just wouldn't expect to. There's not a lot of room to grow. Maybe this would be helpful for them. Maybe they'll do better 10 years from now if they stick to this, but we're not doing studies long enough to know that. And so I think when you say, okay, well, time-restricted eating isn't working, I just don't see that, because the assumption would be that time-restricted eating helps you lose weight separate from decreasing calories. And potentially there could have been an added effect. And even within those papers, you do see a slight change between the two. They just aren't significant differences. And I think you get somewhat of a ceiling effect.
Mm-hmm.
It's like if it's raining outside and the rain washed all the dust off your car, and then you go through a car wash, the rain kind of already got the dust off. You're kind of hitting the same thing twice. And so I wouldn't expect a big difference there. That doesn't mean the car wash doesn't wash your car better. But you might not be able to see a difference there within these outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And just building on that, the way I often think about it is I look at the weight of all evidence as well as the quality of the study, right? So generally what we find is the better the quality of the study, the more likely it is to find a benefit for time-restricted eating. About half of the studies find weight loss benefits. If you pool all that data, you get a statistically significant effect. And then the other thing, there's a little bit of a media effect here, right? So the two studies that recently came out with null results were published in JAMA Internal Medicine and the New England Journal of Medicine. Well, if you look at the top 6 largest studies on time-restricted eating, 4 out of 6 have found a positive benefit. It's just the 2 null results got in higher profile journals, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it gets more media attention. So, the average reader will see those studies and think, oh, it's not working. But when you actually research the field on a daily basis, all the studies, right? And so you pull them together mentally in your head and you say, what does the data tell us? And if there weren't a genuine effect, on average, we expect only 5% of the studies to find an effect. So the fact that we see 50% of the studies find a benefit for weight loss.
Mm-hmm.
To me, at least, suggests there's something there.
Why do you think it is those null findings are finding their way into some of the larger journals? Are people looking for this to fail?
I think there definitely are groups. I mean, very bluntly, yeah. I think there's a lot of people that are very skeptical of it, and are kind of set in a way. And again, all of the studies that have shown a null result, I don't think actually go against the hypothesis we have for time-restricted eating. I mean, I'm of the mindset if you believe something, you should do everything you can to try to prove it wrong. And that's what I've been doing for the past 6 years. And I still have not seen any evidence to prove time-restricted eating doesn't have cardiometabolic benefits. And now we're even seeing more benefits in inflammation. Do I think it's a magic weight loss lifestyle pattern? No, I think it's a lot more nuanced than that. And the studies that have shown null results either didn't have any interaction with participants or very little interaction with participants, or they were combined with something where you just theoretically, like they weren't even powered to see that effect. They're powered to see a change compared to baseline, not a change compared to some other intervention that's almost identical to it in the first place. So I still have seen no evidence to say that time-restricted eating doesn't have health benefits. And I've seen many studies done around the world with diverse populations to show that there are really huge benefits. And even done in different ways, whether you provide food and you have them eat in the lab like Courtney does, which is amazing for looking at mechanism, or if you put them out in the real world and say, go for it, this is your window, log everything you eat. I think there's a lot of evidence there to show that there are pretty widespread benefits.
I just even think about a study we did. We had another study I haven't mentioned yet where we had participants do time-restricted eating for only 4 days. And then we took blood samples both in the morning and the evening. And we saw increases in SIRT1, which is a longevity gene, right, consistent with the intermittent fasting studies in animals. We saw increases in genes associated with autophagy, which suggests greater cellular recycling of worn-out proteins. So there are just enough distinct aspects of health that someone has demonstrated in some study is improved in the absence of weight loss, or even if food intake is matched to the control group, that really suggests there's something robust here. And I will say also, the animal research the consensus is actually pretty amazing in the animal research field. It's something like 80% of studies find some sort of benefit. I mean, which is really large if you think about it. So it's just the human literature that's a little bit more mixed. Now you could argue maybe that's due to the way, time-restricted eating works in humans versus animals. But I think by and large, we need to be running larger studies, or we need different study designs, or there are other elements that are sometimes just not optimized.
So it's not quite the time to give up on TRE just yet. It sounds like to me, from everything that I'm hearing you say, in terms of future trials and also just individuals thinking about this, the benefits that one can get from TRE seem to be dependent on a few things. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the first would be, what is your baseline eating window? If you're currently eating at, say, 11 hours over the day and you decrease that to 9, maybe the benefit isn't as big as if you're eating right now at 14, 15 and you reduce that to 9. And the second is, what is your baseline health? So are you someone that currently has impaired glycemic control and perhaps has pre-diabetes? Well, maybe you'll see greater benefit than someone who already has a normal HbA1c and good blood glucose control. Would those two things be fair and potentially instructive in terms of helping set up future larger trials?
Yes,
I
absolutely.
think in the short term, absolutely. Yeah, I think when you're looking at a research trial, they're usually only funded for hopefully up to 5 years, 3 to 5 years at a time. Human trials take a lot of time and recruitment can be difficult. So you're only following people for maybe up to a year. I think people that are already healthy can still see some benefits, but it's much harder to track in a short period of time. So I still think eating within a 10-hour period should be a goal for everyone. I've yet to see any adverse effects, and I think we could potentially see benefits long-term. But as far as a short-term effect, I would absolutely agree with that. If you're trying to see a change within, 3 to 6 months or even a year, if you have nothing that needs to be improved from the onset, not quite sure we'll see change.
Hey friends, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. A quick message from one of our sponsors who makes this show possible, and then we'll jump straight back into things. If you're familiar with my nutrition philosophy, you will know that I'm a huge believer in plant-rich diets being better for people and our planet. You'll also know that I frequently draw attention to what I describe as nutrients of focus. These are nutrients that science shows plant-based eaters, whether plant predominant or exclusive, can fall short in, which can leave you feeling run down, lacking energy, experiencing brain fog, and generally just not as vital as you'd like to be. For that reason, together with a meal, a plant-based health and wellness company, I formulated Essential 8. Essential 8 is your one-stop multi-nutrient, formulated with DHA, EPA, omega-3s from algae oil, vitamin B12, iodine, vitamin D3, iron, zinc, selenium, and calcium to perfectly complement your plant-rich diet. I personally take Essential 8 every morning with breakfast, just 2 capsules, much easier than supplementing with these 8 key nutrients individually. What's even more convenient is I have a monthly subscription, so it turns up automatically on my doorstep and I never miss a beat. To get yours, head to theproof.com/friends. That's theproof.com/friends. where you'll find a link to purchase Essential 8 that will get you an extra 5% off your first order on top of the significant subscription discount. There will also be a link to this in the show notes. Okay, back to the show. One other trial that I'd like to speak to both of you about, and Courtney, I think you were referring to it. I think it was the one that was published in JAMA. This is the TREAT trial. I think that's the one that you were referring to. And I mentioned Ethan Wise earlier, who was included in that New York Times piece. He seems to have been convinced that there's no benefit to TRE, and this was his trial. If my memory serves me correctly, it was a 12-week intervention. It was comparing a TRE group. It wasn't early TRE. Versus a group that was given some advice around structuring meals over the course of a day. They seemed to find no significant difference in weight loss. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on this trial and what it does tell us, what it doesn't tell us?
Yeah, absolutely. So they were comparing eating 3 meals a day. That's what the control group did. And the control group was required to eat breakfast every day versus effectively skipping breakfast, starting eating at 12 p.m. and finishing eating at 8 p.m. And they found no benefit for weight loss. And also participants lost a little bit of lean mass, though it wasn't an amount that we would consider clinically significant. So this is where it's really important to look at all of the research that's been done on meal timing. So there are about a handful of studies out of Japan that have done these very carefully controlled studies where they compare eating 3 meals a day versus skipping breakfast and eating 2 meals a day. And in all of those studies, they find that skipping breakfast and then, eating at lunchtime and at dinner time, that actually raises glucose levels across the day. So at least in the short term, the data we have on glycemic control suggests that actually skipping breakfast and eating 2 meals is worse. Now, in their particular study, this is where you start asking questions of like, okay, they're eating in a shorter duration, but they're also eating significantly later in the day. They weren't necessarily moving both, breakfast a little later and dinner a little earlier. And in fact, if you actually dig really deep in that paper, you'll actually find that the group that did time restricted eating starting to go to bed later. So this is suggesting they're eating significantly later in the day. So I suspect they didn't find an effect in any endpoint just because we know that there have been studies that show if you tell people eat meals at regular times, that actually improves their cardiovascular health and their metabolic health. So, right. So again, the control group's not a no intervention group. It's definitely an intervention group. And in fact, some of the benefits of time restricted eating may be due to fasting duration, some due to the time of day, and then some due to the regularity of meals. So when I think about meal timing studies, I think about all those different aspects and how they interact together. So you just have to consider them, together. So my suspicion is because they forced the control group to eat so much earlier in the day, that may have wiped out any benefits from time restricted eating. I don't know if Emily will agree with me, but that's my take on that.
Yeah, no, I agree with those points. And one thing I wanted to bring up, so that same group from Israel, from Oren Forey's group, they did a lot of really interesting work on timing of eating. And we've mainly been talking about duration, but the phase, which is kind of getting it early or late, like what time of the day you eat, the regularity of when you eat, so how much variability you have, as well as the frequency of when you eat. Are you eating 16 times a day? Are you eating 3 times a day or 2 times a day? All of those things are timing of eating, and all of those things affect health. And their group also has shown really nice studies showing that if you're just skipping a meal, if you skip breakfast, you do have a higher glucose response to your first meal in the afternoon, just like, Courtney had kind of mentioned. So again, I think that is one big part of it. And it's something really important to think about when you are trying to figure out the right schedule for you. I think regularity of eating time, and even in our studies where they did have a regular eating window, we actually saw that their sleep started to become more regular as well. Like, it does seem like there's this kind of downstream effect. The other issue that I have with a JAMA paper from Ethan Weiss's group is half of the participants were done remotely, where they never actually met with the clinic. They were able to sign up online, which is a great way for reaching out to different populations. But with every pro like that, you have a con as well, in which case, if you actually look at the adherence, the people who did respond had a pretty high adherence, but only about 24% of the responses that they would have expected came in. So there was a lot of unknown of if people were actually doing the intervention itself. And they had half of the participants who did come into the clinic, and they saw better results than those who didn't come in. And so I think whenever you're doing a behavioral intervention, they're usually pretty intensive. If you look into caloric restriction or other dietary interventions, they frequently entail having like support groups where you have to come in and talk about it and all these other things to be able to get that. And that never happens in time restricted only studies. The only times I've seen it are really when you have it like in these last 2 papers that paired it with caloric restriction, or with Courtney's work where they're actually coming in and eating with you. But even then, it requires a lot of work to get that. So without giving as much interaction with the participants, time-restricted eating has actually seen pretty similar results, which I think is pretty shocking in its own right. But if you don't have any interaction with your participants, I don't think any behavioral intervention, you would really expect to see much of a change. So again, I think that's a pretty big caveat to that finding, and it's important to keep in mind. The other thing I'd like to say, just for looking at any time-restricted eating study, is many of them don't even look at what the eating window is at baseline. Luckily, that's become more common, but that's kind of like saying we're going to do caloric restriction, but I don't know how many calories you eat right now. Like, what are you comparing it to, right? And so I think the quality of papers has gone up a lot, and I think this field was trying to figure out what it was exactly and take those things into consideration. But some of the papers that don't find any findings also did not really document when they were eating very well, or it was just on a survey after the fact on self-reporting, which are pretty big caveats to know when someone is actually eating, and it makes it hard to test the efficacy of the intervention itself.
Yeah. And I just want to build on one thing you said, right? So kind of buried in the manuscript, they had half of the participants come in for their assessments in person. And those who came in for their assessments in person, there was a statistical trend towards an improvement in weight loss. So
yeah,
go figure. Exactly. Right? The participants who actually got a little more hand-holding or touch actually were more adherent and lost a little more weight.
Yeah.
You brought up the idea of skipping breakfast again there, and potentially the negative effects this could have on blood glucose control. And I'm not sure if the group in Israel you were speaking to then is the same one we were talking about earlier in this conversation, but it may seem counterintuitive to people who perhaps are skipping breakfast, and let's say they're doing it because it allows them to just have 2 meals. They have their lunch and their dinner, and they're thinking, well, that will help with my caloric intake and help me with my health and weight loss. Can you talk a little bit more to some of these breakfast studies and what we know about the benefits of having more food at the beginning of the day?
Yeah, I think a lot of the breakfast breakfast is the most important, gets a little bit convoluted, and sometimes they're confounded by the fact that people who skip breakfast tend to eat later, or tend to binge eat later at night. And if you just look at that factor, that seems to be the biggest concluding thing. So I think some of that is taken away when you do make sure you are stopping at 8 p.m. That being said, I think this kind of gets back to the circadian component of this, where you want to be taking in food when your body is active and moving and can process that food, and not at the end of the day when you're going to be sitting down and probably be sedentary pretty much for the rest of the day. And all of the studies that have looked at, even in rodent models, the key has been is to eat during your active zone. And it sounds kind of overly simple, but I think that's kind of how I look at it. So I would say if you're awake for a very long period of time and you're not eating, I think that does kind of alter how your body is going to respond to your first food intake. And I think that's what some of these studies have shown. And what we both kind of talked about is that that first meal can have compromised glucose regulation, whereas having something in the morning, even if it's maybe not a huge breakfast, some people don't like a big breakfast. I would say then have a big lunch. But I think saying having a really small breakfast or a small lunch and then binge eating at night, I think we've kind of seen across the board from many different fields that that's really not the way to go. And pushing most of your calories to the first half of your day is really ideal. And again, if you get into the nitty gritty of it, I think it is probably eat breakfast like a king, lunch like a queen, dinner like a pauper, whatever the kind of idiom is. But I think, even if you just had it in the first half of your day, you'll see most of the benefits there. And then to have a dinner that's, high fiber, high, healthy proteins and fats and not as high in carb. I think there's some interesting studies that have come out there too. Especially, this is a whole other topic now, but looking at types of foods that you're eating at different times of day, or if you do have to eat late at night because of certain shift work schedules, controlling the macronutrients of that might have big effects. And I think that's also where the field is going. So even if you can't stick to a specific window, the timing of macronutrients, I think, is also very important. And again, there's many different aspects of food timing, but duration you can encompass many of them and is a bit easier to stick to.
I want to highlight two studies from that group that, at least for me, just kind of blew my mind when they first came out. So the group led by Daniela Jakobowitz and Oren Froy in Israel, they've done about a handful of studies testing the old adage of eating breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. So two of the ones that really blew my mind is first, they did a study in 2015 where they took individuals with type 2 diabetes. And they did what's called a controlled feeding study where they provide all the food and they make sure that the participants, when they're trying the two different eating schedules, they're eating the exact same food. They were able to show in one of these studies that after only 1 week of front-loading your calories to breakfast and lunch, that they were able to reduce mean glucose levels across the day. And not only did they reduce mean glucose levels, but they actually increased insulin secretion, which is huge because we know when you have type 2 diabetes, that actually compromises your beta cells' ability to produce insulin. And over time, they actually die. So they showed with only 1 week, they could improve the functioning of those beta cells and produce more insulin. So amazing. And then the second study that they did that really blew my mind is they did a study in 60 women with PCOS who were struggling with fertility. So they weren't ovulating and they didn't allow their participants to lose weight, but they still had to follow these two eating schedules. And after about 3 months, the group that was eating a large breakfast, about 50% of the women started ovulating again versus only 20% in the control group. Wow. So this is pretty impressive. And what we know now is some of the same circadian clock genes that are involved in, some of the same genes that are involved in producing these 24-hour rhythms and our metabolism physiology also produce rhythms that are shorter and longer than 24 hours, including the menstrual cycle. So I just think it's so cool how everything comes full circle.
Oh, yeah. So chronic circadian disruption will destroy fertility. Absolutely.
Well, I've got some more questions on or related particularly to women's health that I might save for the end, some sort of rapid fire questions that I have that I know often come up with this topic of fasting. So we'll save that for a moment. But just as a way to kind of summarize where we're up to here, and you've really elegantly described some of the not necessarily issues with these studies, but just some things to think about with regards to interpreting them and trying to make sense of the totality of evidence. What, as of today, do you think it is safe for us to say about time-restricted eating and its utility for human health? And what do you think are the remaining gaps where we have some hypotheses, but we need future research to kind of help tease things out a little bit more?
Yes, I think the general finding is, one, it seems to be safe. I think that's one important thing. There have yet to see any serious adverse effects in shorter than 8-hour eating windows. So it does seem to be safe even for those who have type 2 diabetes. So I think that's been an exciting finding to know that this is something that people can do, at least within adults. There hasn't been much done in children yet. I think the other thing is that we have seen across the board in most studies that if you do have compromised glucose regulation, that this can be an effective way to help improve your glucose regulation, even if you're not losing large amounts of weight, even if you don't change your diet. Now, not that you shouldn't. I think these are complementary things. But I see time restricted eating as a healthy component of eating. It's not just what and how much, but also when you eat, it's going to control how your body processes that food and how that food is going to affect your overall health. I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done in the cardiometabolic field and in the inflammation field. So in things such as cancers and how people are going to be able to respond to that. As far as cardiometabolic, there's been mixed findings on cholesterol and triglycerides. And I think some of them have not been maybe sophisticated enough tests. I think if you get into other type of lipo profiles where you can see breakdowns of different types of cholesterol, there might be some interesting things there, or even inflammation around arteries that could change prognosis. So I think there's more to be done in that field to really understand the cardiovascular benefits. But I think I've seen a lot of evidence to show that you can really improve glucose regulation by just simply controlling the timing of when you eat. And so I think that's where we can take it now, and then moving that into more cardiovascular as well as inflammation fields to see how it can help those diseases. And then the thing that's very hard to test is how it could be used preventatively, how it could be part of a healthy lifestyle for anyone to implement to potentially, hopefully, at least delay the onset of chronic disease.
Yeah, and I'll say from my perspective, I think we're a little further away from public health recommendations. So what we need are either larger meta-analyses, or we need like the one large definitive study, with hundreds of participants, where we demonstrate, that time-restricted eating has benefits for weight loss. That's probably the number one thing that people want to know. And we will need something like that before we can make public health recommendations, with the field being mixed, about 50-50. Unfortunately, no dietary guidelines committee is going to recommend TRE yet. They probably want to see a randomized controlled trial, not just a meta-analysis showing there's an effect. I will say recently we just completed a study, and we were estimating the effect in terms of not only the weight loss, but sort of calories per day that it reduces how much you eat by. And we found about a 236 calorie difference. So that's not necessarily a large effect, but I still call that a modest to moderate effect. Mm-hmm. So I would also say we also need to kind of characterize the size of the effect. Now, it's very easy to say that, but as I think Emily did such a good job earlier explaining how different study designs can lead to different effects, right? If we ask people to eat in a 6-hour window, they're probably going to eat less than if it's a 10-hour window, right? So just also understanding, what are the optimal fasting durations that, what fasting durations produce what size of a weight loss benefit, which fasting durations can people stick with, what times of day can people stick with. And one study that my lab is doing is we're actually comparing early versus middle of the day time-restricted eating in the setting of a controlled feeding study. So do we see, what's the relative benefit of early versus later in the day, and kind of teasing apart what people can do. And then the last thing is having longer trials, right? Mm-hmm. So we need studies now that, follow people out for a full year.
Yeah, tell me about that kind of dream study. If there was going to be a big study conducted that would either help reduce uncertainty in this space and show that there is real benefits to time-restricted eating that are worth including in the dietary guidelines, or potentially falsify some of these hypotheses and send scientists yourselves down another sort of rabbit hole, what would that study kind of need to look like?
I think actually it's great that you mentioned the diet fit studies earlier, because that's what I see as the next phase. So a study with something like 300 to 600 individuals who tried time-restricted eating at 2 different times of the day, and then they're followed up for a year. And right now, to give you an example, the largest sample size per group we have is about 90 per group. And that was a study comparing time-restricted eating versus alternate day modified fasting versus a control group out of China. So I think we're going to need sample sizes on the order of about 150 to 300 per group. Maybe actually, something on that. Maybe not quite 300, but something on the order of more like 150 to 200 per group to really nail this question definitively. And also to produce something that's very convincing from like a dietary guidelines committee perspective.
Yeah, I think if you talk about a dream study, and this is not a next step, but if I was talking dream study, right, I'd want it to be a multi-site trial. So you're working in maybe three very different populations, either within the US or internationally, um, where you're able to look at, like Courtney said, much larger populations. And I think even having a subset where you are much more clinically involved in hand holding and having a subset that is having some guidance, but more app driven in a real world setting to see what those effects would be. To see kind of like if you are given instruction, is it something you can follow? Something along the lines of like the diabetes prevention program, where it's still a guided intervention, but a lot of it is done, with some group counseling, but otherwise you're given a lot of information and you can kind of follow along with it. I think that's the dream of where it could go, is if we are able to do big enough studies that it could be something along those lines, where it could be kind of, you provide information, you could join kind of support groups and follow it over time.
Do you have any fear that potentially some of these null findings that have been published in the major journals may impact future funding for larger studies like what you're talking about?
Yes and no. I think time restricted eating had a very hard time getting funding for a very long time. If you see this explosion in studies over the past 5 years, a lot of that is because there was no funding for it the first few years. And even our initial trials, our cell metabolism paper that came out in 2020 and our the Gill and Panda paper in 2015, none of that was funded through national agencies, through traditional funding. It was all foundation and private grants that were willing to take on a riskier subject. And NIH was really resistant to it for a long time. And I think they're now very excited about it. And the fields really explode because it's made enough of a way where we kind of pushed hard enough to say, okay, we need to look into this. So potentially, I think the naysayers will use this to cling on to say, hey, this doesn't work. But again, I have nothing against what the studies are. I think we just have to be careful about how we interpret them and what we're saying we're going to do. If you're trying to write a study to say time-restricted eating is going to improve caloric restriction, I don't know that that's the best way to go. That's really not what we're trying to do here. I think the questions we're asking are pretty significantly different from that. And I don't think that will sway most scientific reviewers from being able to fund legitimate questions.
Yeah, and I can speak to that a little bit too. I know you all had a really hard time convincing anyone to get grant funding. I'll tell you, the first small study that I submitted to the NIH, one of the reviewers gave me a score, an 8 out of 9, which is a terrible score, and said, I don't think there's any future in time-restricted eating, right? So like I'm going to give you almost the lowest score possible to tank this proposal, right? But I was like, that's nice. I think these effects are real in the paper in cell metabolism. And I said, we should study it. And I will tell you, there's actually been a huge shift in enthusiasm for studying intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating. And so much so that the NIH has now, 2 separate institutes have said there's not enough research on time-restricted eating. We are going to fund grants in cancer and in aging. And my lab has partnered with different groups, and we actually ended up getting those grants. And so we have one study now in 300 patients with rectal cancer to see if time-restricted eating can reduce the side effects from chemotherapy and radiation and actually help shrink the tumors. And then we also have another study comparing calorie restriction to time-restricted eating for slowing the aging process in midlife adults, which I'm super, super excited about. So we're even going to look at things like, can time-restricted eating increase stem cell number or help, telomeres not shorten with age? Like, can we basically slow the aging process? So I would say now the tide has definitely shifted. I hope the negative studies don't put too much of a damper on it, but I feel the same way as Emily. It's yes and no, right? It depends whether, if you weight things equally, not just by what you see in the media, then you would come to the conclusion it's still worth studying it, like very much so. But if you only focus on big name journals that publish null results, then, that can be an issue.
Talk to me about cancer for a moment. And I know that there are all sorts of wild claims, I guess, that can be made online. And sometimes kind of enthusiasm can exceed where the published literature is at in any given moment. Am I right in saying that there is some preclinical evidence to suggest that fasting mimicking diet, different protocols may be beneficial as a sort of adjunct therapy to, say, chemotherapy for people with cancer, but it's early and kind of by no means definitive at this stage? Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, that's correct. And The theory behind it is actually fascinating. So it's the theory is called the differential stress sensitization theory. And what they found in both animals and in cells is if you subject them to fasting, that kind of puts them in a self-protective mode. They upregulate these stress resistance pathways. So then if there are any external stressors like chemotherapy and radiation that come along, the cells are already in a self-protective mode. So they actually die at a lower rate. So we see less activation of caspase-3 and they die at a lower rate in the face of chemotherapy and radiation. Conversely, tumor cells, because they have these oncogenic mutations, they're always in growth mode. Because they're in this hyperproliferative mode or this hypergrowth mode, they have to kind of shift what fuel sources they burn if you fast them. And as a result, they actually end up producing more free radicals when they're fasted. So then if you apply chemotherapy and radiation, the data suggests that they actually die at a higher rate. So it's very cool data. And it suggests that you can kind of selectively help the chemotherapy and radiation be more effective by targeting the tumor cells. And then you can also reduce the side effects of chemotherapy and radiation. Now, there have been a number of small studies in humans. And initially, the studies were testing water-only fasting for something like, 2 days or 3 days. And they did find a reduction in some side effects like nausea. But the unfortunate thing is most people are not willing to do water-only fasting. I think in one of their studies, they found only about a quarter of people were willing to do water-only fasting for that long, for 2 days prior to chemotherapy. And so that's where Volter got the idea. So huge props for him. I mean, he's really the biggest player in this field. Developed the idea to create a diet that recapitulates a lot of the benefits of fasting without necessarily doing a complete 24-hour water only or 48-hour water only fast. So he developed the fasting mimicking diet, which is basically a form of what we call intermittent energy restriction, where you eat a very low calorie diet, so typically about 800 calories, and you follow that for usually like 3 to 5 days at a time. And you do that right prior to chemotherapy and radiation. And so they just published one of their first big trials, I think, in breast cancer patients, just over 100 breast cancer patients. The results were not a slam dunk by any means, but they did find some suggestive findings suggesting that they looked at kind of slices of the tumor, and they found that it hadn't progressed as much in some of the women. Mm-hmm. So there was some suggestive data there of the benefit. And they did find also that some of the blood cells were better protected against chemotherapy and radiation. So they sustained less DNA damage.
Was there any information on kind of prognosis or survival rate, or was it too short term to detect that?
Yeah, too short term. And I can't remember. I think the population, the people they ended up enrolling, I can't remember it. It's too bad I can't remember, but they were I think they might have been less sick than they suspected. Mm-hmm. So it was a little harder for them to detect a difference than they were originally expecting. So they ended up ending that trial early.
Okay. Yeah, I read a review by Luigi Fontana, who's based out here in Sydney. I can pop that into the show notes. It was in one of the American Cancer Society journals, and he summarized a lot of this and sort of spoke about the fact that there's some emerging science, still a little bit of a ways to go, but it is certainly very fascinating and worth exploring for sure. Did you want to say something, Courtney?
Yeah, and I think one of the other things I wanted to say is we are also testing this on a molecular level. So one of the things we're doing in our study is we're measuring molecular markers involved in cell growth and cell death. And what we know is intermittent fasting seems to slow down the rate at which cells grow and divide. And that may be a kind of common mechanism underlying some of the benefits for both aging and for cancer. Mm-hmm. And so we'll actually be measuring in this study, rates of autophagy, rates of cell death via apoptosis, and then also cell growth in both tumor tissue and healthy tissue. So it'll be nice if we see an alignment of both clinical benefits as well as molecular benefits.
What does this mean? I'm just thinking here, if someone's listening and maybe they have cancer and are going through treatment or have a friend or family, what does this mean for them right now in terms of actual recommendations?
Yeah, our data is pretty weak at the moment, even though it's suggestive. So I don't think we're anywhere close to being able to recommend that people definitely do this. The studies have not found any negative effects so far, but we're really on the order of just a handful of studies. And some of the sample sizes are 10 people, which is really not enough. I don't think there's a harm in doing water-only fasting for cancer treatment. And in fact, Andreas Michelson's group in Germany has been trying something called, I think it's Buchinger fasting. It's very similar to a fasting mimicking diet, except you consume vegetable juices for a few days. And I think they've gotten some good results with improving the quality of life of people who go through chemotherapy and radiation. So if you're willing to experiment on yourself, probably no negative effects, but we can't promise that there are any benefits yet. The science isn't there yet.
The other interesting aspect of health that you mentioned was aging, and Emily, you spoke about this earlier as well. And there's obviously quite a lot of animal data out there. This is a little bit harder to test in humans. It would require a very, very well-controlled and very long study. What are your thoughts on shortening your eating window and whether this will have an effect on how long you live?
I think especially for those who have metabolic risks or might be pre-diabetic, I think you might be able to potentially delay the progression or stop the progression of some of these diseases, which could potentially cause complications, because none of these diseases are really alone. Like they have high comorbidities. So having diabetes increases the risk for cardiovascular disease. Being overweight increases the risk for a lot of these different things. And so being able to kind of stave off those things might improve, maybe not full lifespan, but your healthy lifetime or quality of life over time. So I think that's something to keep in mind. But you're right. The animal studies are really where we've seen the most data, especially within flies, is actually where you see the longest expansion in life. And it's only a few weeks, so you can do that quite easily. And I know more work will be coming out in rodents fairly soon to look at that as well. But I think, again, we don't see any negative effects, but I think we don't really have the data to say, if you do this, you'll live an extra couple of years, because these studies just aren't long enough to do that yet.
Did you want to add anything to that, Courtney?
Yeah, I'll just underscore the study that found in rodents, which found that at least 40% of the life-extending benefits of calorie restriction are in fact due to time-restricted eating. What was interesting about that study is that was a lower limit. They were only able to establish that at least 40%, but it could be larger, right? So, and in fact, recently, one of the world's longest living men, I wish I remembered his first name, was someone who ate 2 meals a day and stopped eating around noon. So I thought that was quite interesting. And we've often looked at dietary quality and longevity, but no one's really looked at meal timing and longevity. So it'd be super interesting to take a look at that. But this study that I'm involved in will look at some of these molecular mechanisms. So we'll be able to see, what aspects of aging that we're really targeting. So we're going to look at the 9 hallmarks of aging, and these includes things like nutrient sensing, telomere length, senescent cells and things like that. So we should get a pretty complete picture about what aspects of aging, if any, are improved by time-restricted eating.
And what type of eating window are they doing in that study?
In this study, we're doing an 8-hour eating window, and the control groups will be counseled to eat over a 12-hour or longer period. And we're comparing it versus 25% CR. So the original calorie restriction studies in humans where they targeted 25% CR, in reality, they only achieved about 12.5% CR over a 2-year period, right? So, and let me just say, the team that did these studies were phenomenal. I mean, these participants got so much counseling. It just shows you how hard it is to stick with calorie restriction in the long term. So if we find that time-restricted eating has even some of the benefits of calorie restriction for slowing the aging process, I think that will be huge, right? Because our hypothesis is it's way easier to do, time-restricted eating as opposed to calorie restriction.
One thing that we haven't spoken about, and I think you've made it clear that, broadly speaking, time-restricted eating appears to be a very safe intervention. I'd like to speak about adverse events. And for years, I've heard that women in particular are underrepresented in a lot of these studies. I was actually pleased to see, I think the Corey Rinder study and the one in China had a very large percentage of women in them. So that was good to see. But is there enough information out there around narrowing the eating window with regards to it being safe for women of childbearing age, women during nursing, during menopause, etc.?
No. Usually women who are pregnant think they will become pregnant or breastfeeding are excluded from these trials because it hadn't been studied yet and they're considered a vulnerable population. Women who have been postmenopausal and menopause and pre have been included, but not intentionally and in a kind of controlled manner. It's one of the things that I think does need to be looked at. There are some studies in PCOS that are starting to look at kind of, and like Courtney mentioned as well, that are starting to look at some of the benefits of that. From an extremely anecdotal take with a handful of salt, I had been on time restricted eating for years and I continued it while I was pregnant and breastfeeding and had no problems with that. But it was at a 10-hour window. It wasn't anything extreme. But I had already been on it for quite some time. I didn't start that when I was pregnant or breastfeeding. So I think that's another thing to consider. But yeah, I think that's definitely a field that needs to be understood more. I mean, we also don't know how it affects children or if children should be on it. They have very different growth needs. But, sometimes you look at when your children eat and you go, okay, well, she actually is on a 10-hour eating window. I never thought about it that way, but she eats when she wakes up and you know what? She sleeps for like 12 hours at night. So as long as she's not eating like the second before she goes to bed. So she's eating around 10 or 11 hours. And this was never thought of as I'm restricting her eating window by any means, but she sleeps a lot. So that's kind of what it ends up to be. So I think there needs to be more done there. And I think even just understanding even more observational studies being enabled would be very helpful because really the timing of when people eat really isn't well studied. And it's very hard to do because it's something that we forget. If you ask me when you eat, like even if you're trying to remember, it's very hard to remember every little thing that you had. And so until we have a better idea of when everyone eats, it makes it hard to say what will be safe. And again, I think we really have to move to much larger populations to answer this question.
You raise an interesting point there around terminology, and I understand why time-restricted eating is used. But in many ways, if the norm is a kind of extended eating, that's kind of like time-extended eating. And time-restricted eating could be NEW, a normal eating window in some ways.
I like that normal eating window. That's a nice way to think about it. Yeah. Absolutely. I think we really kind of, we went from having, eating when you were active and when it was light out to probably eating to then like 3 meals a day. And now we really have very poor meal structure within the US, at least. If you look at NHANES data, which is a large trial that tracks thousands of people over decades, you see that it goes from having mainly 3 meals a day to going down to having more snacks, and the structure changes. And some people don't even really eat meals. They're mainly snacking all day. I mean, it's really changed. And then you see all these advertisements for like happy hour, after late night menus where it's like after midnight, it's this discount. And it's like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? This is horrible. And so I think, we're really eating at these kind of insane times. It's like, what if you like went into a room that was like natural sunlight at midnight? That would be crazy, right? But we're doing that to our bodies with food all the time now. And it's a huge part of how we interact. Like if you're going out for a night with friends and you're having drinks, you're probably eating, and this can go into the wee hours of the morning. And so I think it's just this very bizarre eating pattern and really caloric intake pattern that we have developed that our bodies really aren't built for.
Do we know much about how time-restricted eating can affect lean muscle? I'm thinking about people who are perhaps training, working out. It could be athletes. It really could just be anyone who's thinking about healthy aging and wanting to maintain some lean muscle mass. Is there any sort of deleterious effect of narrowing the eating window in terms of losing some of that lean body mass?
Yeah, so it's interesting. There have been about half a dozen studies in looking at resistance training in particular. They're not particularly large studies, but by and large, these studies find no negative or positive effect on strength gains, which I think is really important, or on lean mass. Now, there are a couple of weight loss studies that did find a decrease in lean mass. I don't know how to explain that. It could be due to the fact that people Sometimes people, when you prescribe time-restricted eating, they may eat less protein.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to say. The Low et al. Paper is probably the most famous study that found a decrease in lean mass. But I will tell you the amount of the decrease in lean mass is far below the threshold that's clinically significant, right? This could even honestly be due to just fluctuations in water weight, right? So the best evidence we have in resistance-trained individuals suggests no positive or negative effects on lean mass or strength.
Yeah.
I'm interested in Emily, you mentioned there you do a 10-hour eating window. And I'm putting you both on the spot here, so feel free to decline answering your personal eating window schedule. But I'm interested in, do you feel like a 10-hour eating window from, say, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. is the kind of most popular time-restricted eating window that still allows people to have breakfast, lunch, and dinner, albeit a little bit of an earlier dinner?
I think actually 9 to 7 is more popular, at least in the populations that we've worked with. That seems to be the most common one. Personally, I am shifted slightly later. Right now, I'm a 10 to 8. I used to be a 9 to 7. And the reason I shifted was because my only chance to work out is after I put my daughter to bed. And so I have to eat dinner after that. And that's like the earliest I can do. And realistically, I eat a little bit later now because of that. And so I think you have to kind of balance what you can, right? Like there might be times where, okay, now I'm on a 10 and a half hour. It's like, okay, that's not so bad. Like I'm not doing a 14. But I think it comes back to what you can stick to and what your schedule allows for. It should be something realistic because again, this is not some diet where you're going to push yourself really hard for 6 months and do something extreme. This should just be part of what your lifestyle is. And that can look different at different times of your life. And I think as long as you kind of adjust it slowly and make it something realistic and do the best you can, you'll still see a good amount of the benefits.
Yeah. And so I've been doing time restricted eating since 2010. So, 12 years. I'll say the last 2 years I haven't done it very much because I have a daughter. I took a different approach from Emily. So most of the time I have been using a 6 to 8 hour window and just flexing it depending on what I can do because I'm in a lot of meetings each day. So I just couldn't necessarily flex it around my schedule. And I would normally start at 8 a.m. in the morning and then finish between 2 to 4, which I know sounds pretty extreme, but I really liked it. I definitely felt some of the mood benefits. The way I've heard some people describe it is this feeling of peace or serenity. And I definitely felt that. I tried a 5 hour window. I went down as low as a 5 hour window. I think I might have shared this with Sachin at one point when I ran into him in a meeting. I didn't like a 5 hour window because I felt these huge swings in blood sugar from eating it over that short of a period. So I didn't like longer than that. With 10 hours for me, I don't quite feel as many benefits, but that's approximately where I am now. Mm-hmm. But I'm planning to get my window back down. And unlike Emily, I perhaps was maybe more nervous about doing time-restricted eating during pregnancy and breastfeeding, so I went off it altogether because I just didn't want to experiment, and I just wanted to be cautious. Just because there was sufficient data in animal studies that starting time-restricted eating during the juvenile period or in adolescence did have negative effects on growth. So I just wanted to have a clean conscience, on that. So I went off it for that time period.
Have any studies looked at cognitive performance? Speaking anecdotally, I feel a bit conflicted here because I'm hearing what you say about the early time-restricted eating window having some advantages, but I do a lot of work in the mornings. I try and get a lot of my more cognitive, demanding stuff done earlier, and I feel like I do that better in a fasted state. And I'm wondering if anyone has looked at that as to whether the time in which you start eating affects your cognitive ability.
I don't think anyone's looked at the phase of eating and cognitive ability. Courtney, correct me if I'm wrong, but I know that there has been a fair amount of literature on just the circadian patterns of cognitive ability and even of emotion and personality type. So like certain people are very good at editing late at night. Like it seems to be a skill that tends to go there. And you do have different moods at different times of day. And so people do have like kind of clarity of thought at specific times of day. And that is something you can do. In fact, even if you try to give yourself a set of math problems, like fairly simple addition or multiplication, that is not so hard that it's impossible, but hard enough where you have to actually think. You'll be better at it at different times of day. And so I think there is definitely a circadian component to that. I mean, the brain only runs on sugar, so I'm guessing you need something there, but potentially you're breaking down a good amount of that. And some people will say they can't do anything until they've had something to eat. So I'm not quite sure about eating before or after having to do some serious thinking. I don't know. Courtney, do you know any other studies that follow that?
I know about what's called a cohort study where they just follow people over time. It was a cohort study in elderly Italian adults, and they did find, I think, that individuals who practice time-restricted eating had better cognitive function, right? But you can't establish cause and effect. And then related to cognitive function, in our 4-day study of early time-restricted eating, we did find an increase in BDNF levels in our trial in the evening. And BDNF, for those who don't know, actually promotes the survival of certain brain cells called neurons. So we were at least able to demonstrate in humans that some of the factors protective of your cognitive health seem to be activated by time-restricted eating.
Super interesting.
Yeah. The one other thing I'd say as far as emotional kind of control, chronic circadian disruption is known to be directly tied to any affective disorder, bipolar, major depression, to the extent that there are some circadian groups that do these really intensive, months long trials where they might actively circadian desynchronize you. And in those trials, if you or any member of your family has been diagnosed with depression or bipolar, they will not admit you into the trial because it's so likely to trigger an episode. And so we know that circadian disruption causes those problems. And I think it's a matter of time until we get a better understanding on how food alone, opposed to maybe food as well as light schedules or different things like that, might be able to be optimized to hopefully help those that are going through depression or to potentially prevent that, especially when you're pairing it with seasonal depressive disorder, where you do see these changes in depressive symptoms based off of changes in light or lack thereof, whether food timing regularity could help that as well.
Cool. Well, I'll be interested to hear from folks listening, perhaps in the YouTube comments, as to whether they feel cognitively sharper in a fed or a fasted state. I'm sure I'm probably an outlier there. You mentioned training, and that brings me to another question that I get quite a bit. Do you think there would be any difference in doing your training in the fasted state? Let's say, for example, I am doing the kind of 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. type eating window. Would I be better doing my training before 9 a.m., before I start eating, or during the fed state?
I'm glad you asked this question. So the NIH has signaled they want to fund this type of research. So they just did a workshop and I participated in it. So there's some really provocative evidence there that suggests that the time of day that you exercise matters as well as the time of day that you eat. So there have been a couple suggestive studies, and some of these were what we call post hoc analyses, which means you do the study, you find people lose weight and you go back and you say, okay, what are the factors that predict whether people lose weight? So a couple of these studies have found that people who exercise before breakfast, so in the fasted state, lose more weight. And there have been also some short-term studies that have looked at food intake, so how much someone eats. If they exercise before or after breakfast, they've been able to show that, at least acutely, people tend to eat less, and or there are reductions in appetite hormones such as ghrelin. That said, conversely, there's also data suggesting that for individuals with type 2 diabetes, they get a much better benefit for their metabolism when they exercise in the afternoon. So I know that sounds a little bit confusing, but it may in part be due to the fact that they have a different optimal time of day for their circadian rhythms. And we know that, for instance, because usually their best blood sugar control is a little later in the day, unlike the average person without type 2 diabetes, where your blood sugar control is better earlier in the day. And so for them, they don't seem to get as much benefit if they're exercising in the morning, and they get a lot more benefit if they exercise in the afternoon. So it's super fascinating because no one can quite yet reconcile these different results. But nonetheless, they suggest there's an optimal time of day for exercise, and it may depend on the person what that optimal time of day is.
Yeah, just another reminder that these protocols are going to come down to who you are in many cases.
Yeah. Absolutely. This goes into precision medicine, and I think it's also what you're trying to achieve is a big part of when you would exercise, because there are circadian patterns to muscle strength, your heart rate is going to be changing differently throughout the day. Your blood pressure is different throughout the day. So if you're trying to do your absolute best, you're going to be better in the afternoon. But if you're trying to lose weight, like you said, morning might be better. So depending on what you're trying to do, really matters on when you should work out. And there, like Courtney said, there's a lot of research just starting up in this field. I think we'll be seeing a lot more in the next few years.
Yeah, and I think one of the big questions we have at the moment that we don't even know is, does the time of day, like relative to your circadian rhythm, matter more, or is it training in the postprandial versus fasting state? So even very fundamental questions like that we don't know the answer to yet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I have a couple of other little questions as we approach the end of this conversation. What breaks the fast? If I wake up at 7, but my eating window is going to start at 9 a.m., based on Emily's advice, if I have a coffee, and let's just say that's a double espresso, there's no milk or cream or anything added to it, is that coffee going to open up my eating window?
So we've generally said no. There is debate in the field, right? So not everyone agrees on this. So the approach we have taken is if there are any calories in it, it breaks your fast. Obviously, if it's like 2 calories, probably not, right? But if you start talking about 50 calories, yes, absolutely, right? So human bloodstream contains about 10 to 20 calories at a time, depending on your body weight. So that kind of gives you a sense of the scale. That said, there's also some data that caffeine can activate cyclic AMP and may affect your metabolism. And I'll let Emily speak to that because I think you all might have a different full philosophy or best guess on this.
Yeah, not that different. I think when we started this in humans, we went off of what we knew in rodents, which they were only on water. And we really didn't know if caffeine or artificial sweeteners or other things like that would have an effect. And I don't think there's been any study to do a full time restricted eating plus coffee in the morning or plus tea or plus this to say it does or doesn't have an effect. Like Courtney said, caffeine can trigger some things. Cyclic AMP also feeds into the circadian clock. It can also shift things that way. It changes your arousal system, which can also have effects on behavior, which could indirectly shifts clocks. There's also been some studies shown that if you have caffeine before a meal, you can have a higher glucose spike in response to your first meal. In our studies, we have not allowed coffee or anything other than water. We've allowed like a slice of lemon in water or an herbal tea if necessary. We've tried to kind of stay purists merely because we don't know for sure. And I think more would need to be known there. The one exception we had to that was in a study that we're just finishing the revision on, was in firefighters who were 24-hour shifts. And we did allow them to have coffee outside of their window if they needed to, just for safety concerns, because they're working 24-hour shifts multiple days in a row. So if they felt like they needed coffee, we would let them have that. That being said, most of them decrease coffee anyway, but we tend to not. But I think the data is still out. But even in the study, many studies have allowed coffee, like a black coffee, and they still see benefits.
Okay, so just in terms of a kind of takeaway for the person listening, safest option to include tea, coffee, stevia, any kind of low-calorie thing within the eating window. It might be okay outside, but you think that we need a little bit more research?
That's my view on it. I think if you need your black cup of coffee, that's not the worst thing. But if you can keep it in your eating window, I would try to do so. And
Courtney, do you have a slightly different view on that?
No, I just don't think we have enough data. Okay. And we've just been more generous in my studies and let people drink coffee at any time of day.
Yeah. And you mentioned shift workers, and I know this could take us down a rabbit hole, but Emily, you and I spoke about this previously. Courtney, you mentioned earlier that I think you mentioned that shift work is associated with chronic diseases. Clearly, shift workers are very, very important people. We rely on them in very many parts of our society. I'm wondering, since our last conversation, Emily, which was probably a couple of years ago now, has there been any further research looking at shift workers? What types of protocols or strategies that people can perhaps lean into from a meal timing point of view that may help them nurture their circadian rhythms despite these kind of more irregular working hours?
Yeah, so our paper in shift and 24-hour firefighters is coming out soon, but there was really feasibility. It was the main outcome, but also looking at other health outcomes. And we do see that it's feasible. We didn't see any adverse side effects, so they didn't have hunger problems or anything like that, which was nice to see. But in all fairness, 24-hour shift work is the easiest shift work to do a time restricted eating regimen on because their night is still their night. They're able to try to sleep at night. They get woken up many times and it's not the same quality of sleep, but they're still awake during the day always, which is very different than, say, a night shift schedule where you're trying to sleep during the day and you're eating at night. And you're awake at night. And I think there's a lot of debate there, and I'm very excited where that field is going. There's some really exciting work from Australia coming out, actually looking at different macronutrients throughout the night. So there were some cool studies done where they either gave like biphasic eating, so you ate kind of twice a day, maybe about 12 hours apart, and you didn't eat across the night at all, and you'd have better glucose regulation in the morning than if you had a full meal in the middle of the night. And the compromise in between, where they gave him half that meal, they had like half the improvement. And so I think one of the things shifting there is saying, okay, well, maybe it's not a good idea to have a large bowl of pasta in the middle of the night as your meal when you're on a night shift, but maybe switching to lean fats, higher protein, lower carb might be able to help that. But that is such a young field. And a lot more needs to be done there to see how we can say, okay, one, is it possible to stick to something like time restricted during your day when you are active during the day for something like a 24-hour shift worker? And then, it's going to be different for every other shift. And there's so many different types of shift work. A nurse is going to be different than a news anchor, is going to be different, like all these different things, and some of them move. And so I think that's where the field is going. And I think controlling types of foods that you eat is going to be the compromise to say, what can we do to mediate the risks and mediate the damage as much as we can? And sometimes that's going to be time restricted eating. And sometimes that's going to have to go down more into the types of foods that you're eating.
Sure. What would you do if you all of a sudden had to work 10 p.m. to 6 a.m.? That was your regular kind of shift overnight. And so you were up and awake while it was dark, and you would come home after you clock off at 6 a.m. and perhaps go to bed at 8 a.m. How would you set up your meals?
Yeah, that's rough. And this is very anecdotal because we don't have a good answer for this. And some rodent trials have tried, and it's mixed. I think I would, one of the big problems is because you switch back and forth between being awake during the day and being awake at night. And that's one of the really big problems there. And humans who do try to stick to always being awake at night, that doesn't usually work. So you're switching back and forth. One idea is to try a biphasic eating, where maybe I eat at 8 and 8 every day. And it doesn't matter if it's daytime or nighttime. And then maybe on my days off, I could also eat during the daytime when I'm active. And I'd probably have, if I'm really hungry while I'm working, I'd have like some nuts, like a handful of like almonds or something like that. That's really not going to trigger any type of glycemic response. The other option would be to try to stick to some kind of, 10-hour eating during the day. But I don't think that makes sense because then you're not going to get enough, like you're going to be awake for too long and before you get to eat again. So I think if I had my first go, I would probably try a biphasic. But that is, you really, I think, have to test it out and see what works for you and then adjust. And the data just really isn't there to say what is best. And there's such hard trials to run, and there's so many different types of shift work that it's something that I'm very interested in. And I think we really do need to do. I mean, I completely agree with you. The shift work population are key. I mean, we even titled our study the Healthy Heroes Study because they are the heroes of our society. And so I think finding ways to help them mediate the disruption to their circadian system is huge. And so I really want to go down that path, but there's still a lot to know before I can say, do this, it'll work. We just don't know yet.
Let me add two things on top of that. So Frank Shearer's lab just came out recently with a study where they took individuals and had them kind of simulate doing night shift work. And what they ended up testing was, if you're doing night shift work, is it better to eat during your shift in the middle of the night, or is it better to eat during the daytime? And in that study, they actually found it was better for their glycemic control to actually eat during the daytime than on their shift. Now, the big caveat for these studies is these were not individuals who habitually did shift work. And we do know from short-term studies of shift work that we do see adaptation over time, right? So this may not generalize to people who chronically do shift work. Again, distinction between acute and chronic. But I will say I do know right now there is a group, Josie Brossard's group at UC Boulder, I believe, is studying whether time-restricted eating can be a countermeasure. So in other words, can it kind of lessen the side effects of night shift work?
Okay, very cool. Well, I might get that information from you and put some links to whatever's available at this point in time. But I think that's useful information for the moment. Perhaps a biphasic eating pattern is worth trying, and it seems like maybe during overnight, if you're awake, glycemic control might not be the best. So what I'm hearing from you is foods that are high quality protein source and providing more fats may be a better option, but much more data needed to be kind of definitive and have sort of more specific protocols for shift workers.
Yeah, that's fair.
Before we round this out, we have spoken mostly here about the timing of meals. We spoke a little bit about having more of your calories in the first half of the day and potential benefits there. And we spoke a little bit about quality, but we didn't really go into it. And I know that Volta Longo places great emphasis on protein, and there's a large debate out there around protein restriction. And sometimes that comes into this conversation when we're talking about calorie restriction, we're talking about fasting, and particularly longevity, trying to tease out, well, what's responsible for longevity? Is it the restriction of calories? Is it the fasting period? Or is it protein restriction? What are your thoughts on protein?
Yeah, so there were some really elegant studies done over a decade ago where they were able to trace, at least in fruit flies, that the benefits of calorie restriction were in fact due to protein restriction, not to the restriction of carbohydrates or fats or overall energy intake. So there's actually been a ton of work looking, for instance, at methionine restriction, which is one of the sulfurous amino acids. And generally, these studies find up to about 40% extension of lifespan. Interestingly, the data in humans suggests that, at least when you look at it at an epidemiologic level, which means you're not doing a clinical trial, you're just following people over time and saying, okay, what habits tend to correspond with, better health. Volta Longo had done one of these epidemiologic studies and found that I think prior to age, I think it was 60 or 65, protein restriction seemed to be beneficial. But after that age, it actually seemed to be detrimental. So, for instance, I think they saw several-fold increase in the risk of cancer and diabetes with greater protein intake before the ages of 65. But then they saw, I think, an adverse relationship with health after the age of 65. And I don't remember exactly what they looked at, but I thought that was super interesting. And part of that may be traced to the fact that in our later years, we absorb less protein. So protein restriction may be counterproductive.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I think Courtney said it.
Okay, great. Well, Dr. Manoogian, Dr. Peterson, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a very clarifying conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Is there anything that you feel we've missed, given the kind of recent hype in the media, both mainstream and social media around TRE? Is there anything else that you wanted to add that perhaps we didn't get to?
No, I think we covered a ton of ground. I mean, this was a fun conversation, covered everything from cancer to aging, type 2 diabetes, weight loss, and cognition. So it was a really great conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the take home really is, TRE really isn't supposed to be a competitor for, or goes way beyond caloric restriction or some magic weight loss. I think it's been shown in sub-studies to have moderate weight loss without intending to or changing other things. I think it could be part of a healthy lifestyle, but the data is just coming out, and there's a lot of randomized control trials going on right now. And I think we're, in the next few years, we're really going to see more of what time restricted eating really does and get more into the mechanism of it and its applicability to wider populations.
Great. And if folks listening would like to get in touch with you or keep in track with your future work, where's the best place to send them?
You could reach me on Twitter at Emily Manoogian, or you can email me at Manoogian at salk.edu. Those are probably the best ways to reach me.
And you can find my research on PubMed or just search for my last name. And then you can reach me via my email address, which is cpeterso@uab.edu.
Okay. All will be in the show notes. Brilliant. Thank you very much. And please do enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
There we go, friends. I hope this was an informative listen for you on all things time-restricted eating. Given that this episode was quite science-intensive, I thought it would be a good idea to give you a bit of a summary, or at least my biggest takeaways from this episode and the literature on time-restricted eating. Here's where I've landed. If you are wanting to lose weight, time-restricted eating is certainly a tool that you could try. With that said, it's important to understand it's not magic. By giving you less hours to eat, the idea is that you'll consume less calories over the day than you would if you ate over your typical eating window. It's essentially an alternative to tracking calories that may work for some people, particularly those who don't want to track calories. Beyond weight loss, any extra benefits of time-restricted eating seem to depend on two main things. Firstly, your baseline eating window, and secondly, your baseline metabolic health. For example, if you have impaired blood glucose control, perhaps you have pre-diabetes, and currently eat over 15 hours a day, you are more likely to benefit than someone who currently eats over 12 hours a day and has normal blood glucose control. If you do want to practice time-restricted eating, early time-restricted eating seems to be more effective with your eating window starting within the first few hours of waking. An example of this could be 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. or 9 a.m. to 7 p.m., the latter being what Dr. Emily Manoogian said she believes people have the easiest time integrating into their lifestyle. Ideally, within this eating window, you would position more calories in the early to mid part of the day, particularly if weight loss is a goal. If someone is doing shift work overnight, biphasic eating with meals at say 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. or 8 p.m. and 8 a.m. could be helpful, but again, more research is needed in larger groups of people with different baseline eating windows and baseline health to develop more specific protocols. Beyond weight loss and metabolic health, we also spoke about longevity and cancer treatment today. Just how effective time-restricted eating may or may not be for these aspects of health is yet to be fully established. Personally, I'm not getting too carried away here and would like to see a little bit more data, particularly with cancer. Larger groups of patients with various types of cancer showing that time-restricted eating is safe and improves one's prognosis, improvements in actual health outcomes. Hopefully all of that makes sense. As always, thank you very much for joining me for this episode and your interest in science-based conversation. If you enjoyed today's episode and you'd like to show your support for the show, please subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can stay up to date with new episodes and watch them in video format. Please also consider subscribing to the show on the Spotify and/or Apple Podcast app, wherever you enjoy listening to podcasts. You can also leave a comment on the YouTube videos or a review on the Apple or Spotify podcast app. Again, a great way to support the show and make our content more discoverable for others to enjoy and learn from. If you have any comments about the episodes, suggestions for future episodes, including guests that you'd like to see on the show, please leave those in the comments section on YouTube. I myself and my team will take note of these comments when planning future episodes. Finally, the best way to support the show and receive discounts on products that we love is by checking out our sponsors at theproof.com/friends. Enjoy your week, stay well, and I look forward to catching you in the next episode.